I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. The bodies had been prepared, the death masks had been cast, the people had learned the truth. The prophet and patriarch had been shot to death by anti-Mormons. The bodies were placed in coffins, which were covered with black velvet fastened with brass nails. They placed a glass lid over the face of each body to protect it, and the coffin was lined with white cambric. Then Emma and Mary, Joe's and Hiram's first wives, were allowed into the mansion room to see their husbands. The children came along too. Quote, Emma, who was at the time pregnant, was then permitted to see the bodies. On first seeing the corpse of her husband, she screamed and fell, but was supported by Dimmock B. Huntington. She then fell upon his face, kissing him, calling him by name, and begged of him to speak to her once more. The scene was too affecting almost to be borne. Mary, Hiram's wife, was also admitted, and manifested calmness and composure throughout the trying scene. The children of the martyred prophet and patriarch were then admitted to see the bodies, when the scene beggared description, being perfectly heartrending. End quote. The next morning at 8 a.m., the bodies were placed in the main living area of the Nauvoo mansion, and the doors were opened to receive the morning procession. Estimates claim about 8,000 to 10,000 Mormons filed through the Nauvoo mansion on June 29, 1844, to view the bodies. People took these deaths in many different ways, and we're lucky that some of them took the time to sit down and express their thoughts in writing. So let's spend some time with these folks. Let's start with Emma Hale Smith and Mary Fielding Smith. Of course, Emma was the first wife of Joseph. Mary was Hiram's first wife. Neither of these women wrote any of their own thoughts at the time, so the best that we can do is read accounts from those who observed them on that distressing day. And you'll recognize a little bit from the history of the church that I read earlier, but there's a fair amount more information here to help us visualize the scene. And this is from Mormon Enigma. Quote, B.W. Richmond said Emma tried several times to walk across the room, but each time she fainted. Finally, a friend helped her from the room. Then Mary Fielding Smith entered with her 4 children. She trembled at every step and nearly fell, but reached her husband's body and kneeled down by him, clasped her arm around his head, turned his pale face upon her heaving bosom, and then a gushing, plaintive wail burst from her lips. "Oh, Hiram! Hiram, have they shot you? My dear Hiram, are you dead? Oh, speak to me, my dear husband. I cannot think you are dead, my dear Hiram." Richmond said, her grief seemed to consume her, and she lost all power of utterance. Her 2 daughters and the 2 young children clung some to her body, falling prostrate upon the corpse and shrieking in the wildness of their wordless grief. A few minutes later, Dimmock Huntington and another man assisted Emma back into the room. Dimmock held his hat up to shield her view of Joseph. The 2 led her over to where Hiram lay, and Richmond took her hand and placed it on Hiram's forehead. Emma stood for a minute, then said, "Now I can see him. I am strong now." Unassisted, she walked to Joseph, where she kneeled down, clasped him around his face, and sank upon his body. Suddenly her grief found vent, and sighs and groans and words of lamentations filled the room. "Joseph! Joseph!" she said. "Are you dead? Have the assassins shot you?" Her children, 4 in number, gathered around their weeping mother and the dead body of a murdered father, and grief that words cannot embody seemed to overwhelm the whole group. Richmond said Emma spoke softly to Joseph, and the only words he heard were the ones he recorded. Young Joseph remembered her saying, "Oh, Joseph, Joseph, my husband, have they taken you from me at last?" 24 years later, Dimmock Huntington claimed he heard Emma ask Joseph to forgive her. End quote. Lucy Mack Smith. Lucy needs no introduction. She was mother of Joseph and Hiram. She dictated this to Martha Corey after she withstood the pain of bearing 5 of her 6 sons, as well as her husband, and she was quite late in years. Quote, "This shall be my testimony in the day of God Almighty, and if it be true, what will Governor Lilburn Boggs, Thomas Carlin, Martin Van Buren, and Governor Ford answer me in day when I shall appear where the prayers of the saints and the complaints of the widow and orphan come up before a just and righteous judge, who will be and is not our only judge, but the judge of the whole earth? Will not the Lord then say unto those who have thus suffered us to be thus abused, that have not bound up that which was broken, neither brought against that which was driven away, neither have ye sought that which was lost, but with force and cruelty have ye ruled my people? I am now 70 years of age, and a native of the United States, and although my father and my brothers fought hard and struggled manfully for to establish a government of liberty and equal rights upon this the home of my birth, oh, for a lodge in some vast wilderness, some boundless contiguity of shade, where rumor of oppression and deceit might never reach me more. Let me leave the tombs of bones of my fathers and brothers, and the bones of my martyred children, and go to a land where never man dwelt. Farewell, my country. Thou hast killed the prophets, and hath exiled them that were sent unto thee. Once thou wert fair, once thou wert lovely, fair ye pure, wert pure and lovely. When the legislators were just men and lawgivers, sought to make the people like unto themselves, was righteous and good men. But now thou art fallen. The life to which wisdom and justice and guilt, debauchery, and reigns thy tables are filled with smut and filthiness, and the hearts of people with rottenness and deceit. But oh, if there is yet one in the midst of this sink of pollution, in whose breast flows one feeling that warmed the heart of Washington, come forth, I pray you. Turn yourselves, men did spurn or spot, which sow pollution, that nothing can cleanse it but judgments of him who is a consuming fire. I will not dwell upon the awful scene which succeeded. My heart is thrilled with grief and indignation, and my blood curdles in my veins whenever I speak of it. After the corpses were washed and dressed in their burial clothes, we were allowed to see them. I had for a long time braced every nerve, roused every energy of my soul, and called upon God to strengthen me. But when I entered the room and saw my murdered sons extended both at once before my eyes, and heard the sobs and groans of my family, and the cries of father, husband, brothers from the lips of their wives, children, brother, and sisters, it was too much. I sank back, crying to the Lord in the agony of my soul, my God, why hast thou forsaken this family?" A voice replied, "I have taken them to myself, that they might have rest." Emma was carried back to her room, almost in a state of insensibility. Her oldest son approached the corpse and dropped upon his knees, and laying his cheek against his father's and kissing him, exclaimed, "Oh, my father, my father!" As for myself, I was swallowed up in the depth of my afflictions, and though my soul was filled with horror past imagination, yet I was dumb until I arose again to contemplate the spectacle before me. Oh, at that moment, how my mind flew through every scene of sorrow and distress which we had passed together, in which they had shown the innocence and sympathy which filled their guileless hearts. As I looked upon their peaceful, smiling countenances, I seemed to almost hear them say, "Mother, weep not for us. We have overcome the world by love. We have carried to them the gospel that their souls might be saved. They slew us for our testimony, and thus placed us beyond their power. Their ascendancy is for a moment. Ours is an eternal triumph." I then thought upon the promise which I had received in Missouri, that in 5 years Joseph should have power over all his enemies. The time had elapsed, and the promise was fulfilled. End quote. William Clayton is a personal secretary of Joseph Smith. He's a keeper of the Council of 50 Minutes and Joe's personal journal. He was very close to the prophet and was instrumental in building the Nauvoo kingdom. Quote, And now, O God, wilt thou not come out of thy hiding place and avenge the blood of thy servants? That blood which thou hast so long watched over with a fatherly care, that blood so noble, so generous, so dignified, so heavenly, you, O Lord, wilt thou not avenge it speedily, and bring down vengeance upon the murderers of thy servants, that they may be rid off from the earth, and that the earth may be cleansed from these scenes? Even so, O Lord, thy will be done. We look to thee for justice. Hear thy people, O God of Jacob, even so, amen. Few expressions were heard save the mourns for the loss of our friends. All seemed to hang on the march of God and wait further events. Some few can scarce refrain from expressing aloud their indignation at the governor, and a few words would raise the city in arms and massacre the cities of Warsaw and Carthage and lay them in ashes, but it is wisdom to be quiet. After the bodies were laid out, I went to see them. Joseph looks very natural, except being pale through loss of blood. Hiram does not look so natural. Their aged mother is distracted with grief, and it will be almost more than she can bear. The blood of those men and the prayers of the widows and orphans in a suffering community will rise up to the Lord of Sabaoth for vengeance upon those murderers. End quote. Eliza R. Snow, a powerful poet, as well as a personal secretary of Emma in the Nauvoo Relief Society and a close friend of the Smith family. Eliza R. Snow frequently wrote poems to specific people for reasons of mourning or encouragement or threatening them to keep their mouth shut. She was also a dearly beloved plural wife of Joseph, creating plenty of conflict in her life as she was marrying age, but she was off limits to be courted by other men. She became the most powerful woman in Utah. Quote, the assassination of Generals Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith, first presidents of the Church of Latter-day Saints, who were massacred by a mob in Carthage, Hancock County, Illinois, on the 27th of June, 1844. Ye heavens attend, let all the earth give ear, let gods and seraphs, men and angels hear. The worlds on high, the universe shall know what awful scenes are acted here below. Had nature's self a heart, her heart would bleed at the recital of that horrid deed. For never since the Son of God was slain has blood so noble flowed from human vein as that which now on God for vengeance calls, from freedom's ground, from Carthage prison walls. O Illinois, thy soil has drank the blood of prophets martyred for the truth of God. Once loved America, what can atone for the pure blood of innocence thou'st sown? Were all thy streams in teary torrents shed to mourn the fate of those illustrious dead? How vain the tribute for the noblest worth that graced thy surface, O degraded earth! O wretched murderers, fierce for human blood, you've slain the prophets of the living God, who've borne oppression from their early youth to plant on earth the principles of truth. Shades of our patriotic fathers, can it be, beneath your blood-stained flag of liberty? The firm supporters of our country's cause are butchered while submissive to her laws? Yes, blameless men, defamed by hellish lies, have thus been offered as a sacrifice to appease the ragings of a brutish clan that has defied the laws of God and man. 'Twas not for crime or guilt of theirs they fell. Against the laws they never did rebel. True to their country, yet her plighted faith has proved an instrument of cruel death. Where are thy far-famed laws, Columbia? Where thy boasted freedom, thy protecting care? In this land of rights, stern facts shall say, if legal justice here maintains its sway, the official powers of state are sheer pretense when they exert it in the saints' defense. Great men have fallen, and mighty men have died. Nations have mourned their favorites and their pride. But two, so wise, so virtuous, great and good, before on earth at once have never stood. Since the creation, men whom God ordained to publish truth where error long had reigned, of whom the world itself unworthy proved. It knew them not, but men with hatred moved. and with infernal spirits have combined against the best, the noblest of mankind. O persecution! Shall thy purple hand spread utter destruction through the land? Shall freedom's banner be no more unfurled? Has peace indeed been taken from the world? Thou God of Jacob, in this trying hour, help us to trust in thy almighty power. Support thy saints beneath this awful stroke. Make bare thine arm to break oppression's yoke. We mourn thy prophet, from whose lips have flowed the words of life thy spirit has bestowed. A depth of thought no human art can reach, from time to time rolled in sublimest speech, from the celestial fountain through his mind, to purify and elevate mankind. The rich intelligence by him brought forth is like the sunbeam spreading o'er the earth. Now Zion mourns, she mourns an earthly head. The prophet and the patriarch are dead. The blackest deed that men or devils know since Calvary's scene has laid the brothers low. One in their life and one in death, they proved how strong their friendship, how they truly loved. True to their mission until death they stood, then sealed their testimony with their blood. All hearts with sorrows bleed, and every eye is bathed in tears. Each bosom heaves a sigh. Heartbroken widows' agonizing groans are mingled with the helpless orphans' moans. Ye saints, be still, and know that God is just. With steadfast purpose in his promise trust, girded with sackcloth own his mighty hand, and wait his judgments in this guilty land. The noble martyrs now have gone to move the cause of Zion in the courts above. Published in Times and Seasons, July 1st, 1844. End quote. B.W. Richmond. This is an account written by a non-Mormon who witnessed the funeral procession, which describes what he saw with Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris, Joe's first official plural wife, and the widow of the famed William Morgan, who disappeared after publishing an expose on Freemasonry. Quote, while the two wives were bewailing their loss and prostrate on the floor with their 8 children, I noticed a lady standing at the head of Joseph Smith's body, her face covered and her whole frame convulsed with weeping. She was the widow of William Morgan, of Masonic memory, and 20 years before had stood over the body of her husband found at the mouth of Oak Orchard Creek on Lake Ontario. She was now the wife of Mr. Harris, whom she married in Batavia, and who was a saint in the Mormon Church and a High Mason. She is a short person with light hair and very bright blue eyes and pleasing countenance. I had called on her a few days previous to this occasion, and while conversing with her, put my hand on a gilt-edged volumen laying on the stand. It was Stearns on Masonry, and contained the likeness of William Morgan. She said she had taken it out, and thought if the mob did come and she was obliged to flee or jump into the Mississippi, she would take it with her. End quote. Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball. Now, Young and Kimball, of course, at this time were traveling through the eastern states and holding meetings with powerful individuals for Joe's presidential campaign. They both record when they first heard the rumors that Joe had been murdered, as well as when they received actual confirmation. From Brigham Young, quote, July 9th. I heard today for the first time the rumors concerning the death of Joseph and Hiram Smith. July 16th. While at Brother Beeman's house in Petersboro, I heard a letter read which Brother Livingston had received from Mr. Joseph Powers of Nauvoo, giving particulars of the murder of Joseph Smith. The first thing which I thought of was whether Joseph had taken the keys of the kingdom with him from the earth. Brother Orson Pratt sat on my left. We were both leaning back on our chairs. Bringing my hand down on my knee, I said, "The keys of the kingdom are right here with the church." Received a letter from Brother Woodruff confirming the news of the death of the prophets. End quote. Heber C. Kimball was a close friend of Brigham Young before they both joined the church in the early 1830s. Heber's wife, Valotte, and he shared many letters back and forth, and Heber himself was uneducated, and his writing reflects it, but he was a relatively faithful journal keeper. Heber and Valotte's daughter, Helen, was given to the prophet at the age of 14 to be his wife. Quote, July 9th, Tuesday. The papers were full of news of the death of our prophet. I was not willing to believe it, for it was too much to bear. The first news I got of his death was on Tuesday morning in Salem of the 9th. It struck me in my heart. July 12th, Friday. Towards night, one of the brethren went to the office and got one letter from my wife, up the 24th, which day he gave himself up in company with Hiram Richards and John Taylor 3 days before they were killed. This letter satisfied us that the brethren were dead. O Lord, what feelings we had. July 14th. Sunday morning went to meeting, read the news to the saints. Great sorrow prevailed, and agreed to dress in the morning. O Lord, how can we part with our dear brother? O Lord, save the 12. End quote. Dan Jones. Dan Jones was Joe's little birdie of Nauvoo. Dan Jones always had intel that was valuable to the prophet about people in and out of the city. Because of his ability to gather intel, he became captain of the steamer that was owned by the prophet on the Mississippi, the Maid of Iowa, where Jones saw most people who entered and exited the city via the water. He was a very close friend of Joseph Smith, and he was one of the last of Joe's trusted acolytes who was chased out of Carthage by the Carthage Greys the day that the assassinations happened. This is a long read, but it's worth it. Quote, about midnight, a steamboat came down the river, and I went on board toward Quincy, 40 miles from there. And before daylight, the boat called at Warsaw on its way, and great was the tumult which was there. It was announced with great delight to the passengers on the boat that Joe and his brother Hiram had been killed at Carthage jail. Oh, how sweet was this news to their chops. That old Sharp again had already published an extra with great haste accusing the Mormons of having gone to Carthage to save the prisoners, and that the guards in carrying out their deed had shot Joseph and Hiram Smith lest they escape, when in fact I was the last Mormon to have been in Carthage and had been driven out as if at bayonet point. Yes, when in fact it was that very man, Sharp, who was leading those who killed the prisoners, boasting that he had put one bullet through old Joe. And when his fingers were still dripping with innocent blood, he proclaimed to the world that it was the saints who had done it, and invited all from everywhere to gather to defend Warsaw, that the Mormons had burned Carthage to ashes and killed its inhabitants, Governor Ford and all, and that they expected them to burn Warsaw at any minute. Yes, he published this in his paper and sent messengers to the other countries to call the militia to defend them, when in fact he knew that he was in no danger whatsoever from the saints. And when I was there, I heard his party admit and praise the cunningness of Sharp's trick to get the people there, and that their objective was to attack the city of Nauvoo and kill or expel the damned Mormons. This false story about the massacre of Joseph and Hiram Smith flew across the world, and we did not think that the truth had even yet been determined. An example in that all of the publications of that man Sharp and his party against the saints, I was so impulsive as to contradict them on the bank from what I knew, and had the boat not been alongside to jump onto, they would have killed me for what I said. After reaching Quincy, I saw the messengers of Sharp had arrived and had stirred up the entire city to the point that they were expecting the Mormons to come there and kill them too, and the militia was hurriedly preparing to go save Warsaw, as they supposed. When I got the opportunity with the people together, I opposed those lying messengers to their faces, and the people then saw that they were not in danger, and that not one of the Mormons had even lifted his hand against any one of them, and had no such intention. Then everyone returned to his business, and I went with the other steamboat toward Nauvoo, where I arrived at 8 o'clock the next morning. Oh, the sorrowful scene to be seen in Nauvoo that day! There has never been nor never will be anything like it. Everyone sat along the streets, all the shops closed and every business forgotten. Onward I quickened my pace until I reached the house of the late Joseph Smith. I pushed my way through the sorrowful crowd until I reached the room where his body and that of his brother had been placed, for they had been brought from Carthage the previous day. There they lay in their coffins, side by side, majestic men as they suffered side by side from prison for years. And they labored together, shoulder to shoulder, to build the kingdom of Emmanuel. Eternal love bound them steadfastly to each other and to their God until death. And now my eyes beheld the blood of the two godly martyrs, mingling in one pool in the middle of the floor, their elderly mother, godly and sorrowful, on her knees in the midst of the blood between the two, a hand on each one of her sons who lay in gore, her heart nearly broken by the excruciating agony and the indescribable grief. At the head of the deceased sat the dear wife of each one, and around their father stood 4 of Joseph's little children and 6 of Hiram's children, crying out intermittently, "My dear father, and my dear father too." Another would say, with no reply except the echo from the walls, "Oh, my father." In the hearts of the mothers, "My husband is killed." And the gray-haired mother groaning pitifully, "Oh, my sons, my sons." Each in his turn, the thousands made their way forward, sad and desirous of having the last look at their dear brethren, whose solemn counsels and heavenly teachings had been music in their ears, lighting their paths and bringing joy to their hearts on numerous occasions. On the streets around it was almost the stillness of the grave which reigned, but all, the noble as well as the humble, with crystal tears streaming down their cheeks. Even the sun and the elements had stilled as if in surprise, and all nature looked at the unended madness of man towards some of the best on the earth in any age or part of it. I shall ever remember my feelings at that time. Now I saw the 2 wisest and most virtuous men on the earth, without any doubt, whom I had seen just a while before, preaching tenderly from between the iron bars of their jail the gospel of peace to those who wanted to kill them. The 2 stood like reeds in the midst of the storm as witnesses of Jesus, despite the jealous fury of the press, of the pulpits, and of the mobs of the age. And just like the reed, they straightened up their heads after every breeze and scorned worldly profit and fame. Steadfast they clung to their objective until they had finished their work, and like their elder brother and their leader before them, they did not love their lives unto death, nor did they refuse to face knowingly the slaughter. Rather, they leaped onto the bloody altar which they saw waiting for them in Carthage, so they could have a better resurrection. But what pen can describe that scene and the feelings of thousands of mourners? The only comfort that kept them from sinking under the oppression, the loss, was knowing that a day of swift reckoning would come also, before long, and that he who has the correct scales in his hand perceives the whole and will... ... But I restrain myself. It is easier for the reader to imagine this scene than it is for me to portray it in its results. The 2 were buried secretly by one another's side, for there was a reward of several $1,000s already offered by their enemies for their heads." End quote. Jane Elizabeth Manning James. She was an early member of the church. Jane Manning James was a young black woman who moved into the Smith home and who was, in my opinion, Joseph's only African-American wife. She lived and worked in the Nauvoo mansion, just like all of other Joe's teenage wives. Quote, "I knew the prophet Joseph, that lovely hand. He used to put it out to me, never passed me without shaking hands with me wherever he was. Oh, he was the finest man I ever saw on earth. When he was killed, I could have died, just laid down and died." End quote. William Daniels in The Nauvoo Neighbor. Now, Daniels is a relatively unknown character in Nauvoo history, but he's clearly writing from a Mormon perspective, as well as that of an eyewitness to the actual gunfight in Carthage. His account was given in an affidavit and then embellished by a Mormon writer in May of 1845, where it was published in the Nauvoo Neighbor. Now, he claims a few fantastic details, but there are other details he provides which are contextual and helpful to understand the general events of that day. Quote, "The storm had passed away. The cowardly demons had fled, and I stood a spectator gazing on the scene. There lay Joseph Smith, the martyred leader of thousands who revered him, the man who had passed like a magic spirit through society, and in a career of a few years had lit up the world with wonder, astonishment, and admiration, was left dead upon the ground. He lay full low, yet in my contemplations I regarded him as the triumphant conqueror left master of the bloody field. 84 men, fiends, armed with United States muskets and other weapons, had the unparalleled heroism to murder him while a prisoner, while he had the nerve and presence of mind to contend with such an unequal force, and with a pocket pistol kill and wound as many as they. In him was the spirit of dauntless bravery exemplified. But a few days before, this noble figure rode at the head of a mighty legion, numbering 5,000 brave hearts and 10,000 strong arms. His presence gave them courage. His words animated their hearts and nerved their limbs. And the large heart that beat within his manly chest entwined around it with their love and affection by the generosity and nobility of his principles. In this situation, he had the power to defend himself. How insignificant was the power of this contemptible mob in comparison with this force that could have borne him off triumphant in defense of all their resistance. From this position of power he descended, threw down the sword that could have protected him from the menace of mobs, and trusted himself to the honor and fidelity of men and the boasted majesty of American jurisprudence. Oh man, how worthless are your promises! How perfidious are your ways! He that would have died for the maintenance of his honor fell a sacrifice to the broken faith of other men. The murder took place at 15 minutes past 5 o'clock p.m., June 27, 1844. People talk about Mormon thieves when they have 84 beings, fiends in human shape, running at large in their community who were actually engaged in murder. The people of Illinois talk about Mormon usurpation and treasonable designs in their leaders, and their Senate chamber echoing with the denunciation of a fiend yet dripping with the warm blood of innocence. The legislature and governor repealed the Nauvoo City Charter for some pretended stretch of municipal power, and they welcomed to their councils a being with an indictment hanging over his head for the highest crime known to the laws. They talk about the Mormon abuse of habeas corpus while they pass special decrees that no member shall be subject to any process, whether civil or criminal, during the session of the Senate, for the special benefit of a murderer, thereby releasing him from the custody of the sheriff and screening him from justice. They prate about Mormon disloyalty while the plighted faith of the state is broken and her honor trampled in the dust. Gentle reader, I have given as faithful a narrative as I possibly could. I have related scenes through which I myself have passed, scenes of danger, excitement, and wickedness. My life has been hunted by day and by night. The quietude of my family has been broken up, and the villains are still determined to take my life. I have thus far eluded them, but I know not when my life may be taken as a sacrifice to atone for telling the truth in a free country. But I am at the defiance of devils and emissaries of hell, and will not shrink from my duty or cower under their menaces." End quote. How does somebody describe grief? We see a consistency among these accounts that the sorrow and the mourning the Mormons experienced was ineffable, is indescribable. Joseph Smith was their supreme leader, and when thousands of people are left directionless by the death of their visionary master, the grief is compounded beyond anything that we can understand. Further complicating matters, there was no plan of succession, and the people knew it. These deaths meant more to the thousands of people in Nauvoo that day of June 29th than anybody else across the world. It immediately cast them into a world of uncertainty and instability, making them exceptionally vulnerable to a tyrant at heart to come along and step into the power vacuum. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There was still a bounty on the head of Joseph Smith. After the public viewing, the doors to the Nauvoo mansion were closed, and the bodies were removed from their coffins and replaced by sandbags, where they were buried in a public graveside service. The actual bodies were buried that night by 9 Freemasons during a heavy rainstorm in 2 unmarked plots at the northwest corner of the unfinished Nauvoo house. They covered the plot with some brush and some rubble, and then the rainstorm further concealed the plots, and by morning there was no evidence of where Joe and Hiram's bodies were buried. Not even the pallbearers knew that they were burying sandbags in the public procession. And here, Emma really exhibits her prowess and understanding of power dynamics. Whoever controlled the bodies had a strong claim to the throne, and she was sure to keep the bodies well concealed. A few days later, it was feared that the whereabouts of the bodies had been discovered, that one of those Freemasons had squealed, so Emma coordinated their removal to a new location. Once again, under the cover of night, around midnight, 4 different Freemasons dug up and moved the bodies to the Nauvoo homestead, the home where the Smiths lived until the Nauvoo mansion was completed in early 1843. Here, those bodies were buried under the cover of night and marked by a beehive which was placed over the top of them. Now, this location was discovered soon after, and Emma, with increasing desperation to keep control of the bodies, had them moved to a secret location on the property of a guy named Davidson Hibbard in a small grove of trees. Here, the bodies remained for years, and this place became a favorite place of Joe and Emma's youngest son, David Hiram Smith, to visit as a child. People knew this little area as David's Chamber, not thinking any more of the place than just, that's where young little David likes to go thinking or playing out in the woods. This, however, was also a temporary burial location. After a couple of decades, as Emma was becoming very late in years, she had the bodies exhumed one more time and moved to a location in Nauvoo that has been lost, and she was also buried there. It wasn't until 1928 that grandson of Emma and Joe, Frederick M. Smith, as prophet of the RLDS Church, located the bodies and exhumed them one last time and placed them in a sacred permanent place of honor where the bodies remain to this day. When they were exhumed in 1928, Fred M. also allowed the remains to be photographed and examined, and those records and those reports are in the Community of Christ archives to this day. Emma recognized that whoever controlled the bodies controlled the church, so she was a good Mason and kept the bodies secret and under her control. If she hadn't retained control of the bodies, as well as most of Joe's property in Nauvoo, the RLDS Church may have never been founded by her oldest son, Joseph III, in 1860, when he rose to the mantle of prophet following the patrilineal steps of his father, who was assassinated 16 years prior. Of course, the progression of all of the events, those are stories for another time. An event of the magnitude of a national public figure and, the President of the United States candidate being assassinated, it inevitably caught fire across the nation. From Boston to South Carolina, papers had been covering the newest intelligence of the Mormon insurrection since the Nauvoo Expositor was published and disseminated across the nation. With the prophet dead, the nation's eyes turned to the Mormon kingdom on the Mississippi. First to print was the Muscatine Journal out of Bloomington, Iowa on July 5th, which printed the public declaration from Governor Ford that we're going to read in just a second here. The Alton Telegraph and the Democratic Review out of Alton, Illinois, published on July 6th the article from the Warsaw Signal that we read last episode. The Holly Spring Gazette from Holly Springs, Mississippi, published another account in addition to the Warsaw Signal article on the same day, along with the Times-Picayune out of New Orleans, further down the Mississippi River. Then intelligence hit New York, and the Buffalo Commercial, the Evening Post, the New York Tribune, the Daily Madison out of D.C., the Public Ledger out of Philadelphia, the Bangor Daily Whig and Courier out of Bangor, Maine, all published articles based on the Warsaw Signal article in the days of July 8th to July 10th, which then continued to carry word across the nation, and within 3 weeks, word hit Worcestershire, England. I think that's how you're supposed to say it, Worcestershire, England, in the Barrows Worcester Journal of August 1st. So with the bodies buried, the Mormons tossed into chaos, and news of these deaths burning across the nation. It was chaos, it was uncertainty, and the nation's focus in this heated election year in the battleground state of Illinois with a Democrat governor, all of these things were just so much to handle, and all that could be done was assess the situation, try to control the damage, and move forward. There was also the anti-Mormon perspective in all of this, as well as the government's perspective to consider in all of this. So let's have a look at the guy who started the anti-Mormon political party and was the most vocal critic of the Mormons for all of Nauvoo history, Thomas Sharp in the Warsaw Signal. Quote, "The St. Louis Gazette says that the men that killed the Smiths were a pack of cowards. Now, our view of the matter is that instead of cowardice, they exhibited foolhardy courage, for they must have known or thought that they would bring down on themselves the vengeance of the Mormons. True, the act of an armed body going to the jail and killing prisoners does appear at first sight dastardly, but we look at it as though these men were the executioners of justice, and their act is no more cowardly than is the act of the hangman in stretching up a defenseless convict who is incapable of resistance. If any other mode could have been devised or any other time selected, it would have been better, but as we have heard others say, we are satisfied that it is done and care not to philosophize on the modus operandi." End quote. This is pretty representative of the anti-Mormon perspective. They felt justified in the act, but then they kind of had trouble justifying it in the public discourse. Vigilante justice is hard to rationalize after the fact, yet Thomas Sharp tried. Now let's discuss kind of the morals of this entire situation near the end, in the conclusion of the episode. Next, let's hear from the guy who was resoundingly blamed by the Mormons for the assassinations and blamed by the anti-Mormons for letting Mormon lawlessness get out of hand in the first place, Governor Thomas Ford. This was his public declaration immediately after the Carthage gunfight, while he was stationed in Quincy, Illinois, trying to keep his state from spiraling into civil war just 4 months before the November election. This is titled "To the People of the State of Illinois," and it was published in the Times of Seasons, as well as all across Iowa, Mississippi, Missouri, and the state of Illinois. Quote, "To the people of the state of Illinois, I desire to make a brief but true statement of the recent disgraceful affair at Carthage in regard to the Smiths, so far as circumstances have come to my knowledge. The Smiths, Joseph and Hiram, have been assassinated in jail, by whom it is not known, but will be ascertained. I pledged myself for their safety, and upon the assurance of that pledge, they surrendered as prisoners. The Mormons surrendered the public arms in their possession, and the Nauvoo Legion submitted to the command of Captain Singleton of Brown County, deputed for that purpose by me. All these things were required to satisfy the old citizens of Hancock that the Mormons were peaceably disposed, and to allay jealousy and excitement in their minds. It appears, however, that the compliance of the Mormons with every requisition made upon them failed of that purpose. The pledge of security to the Smiths was not given upon my individual responsibility. Before I gave it, I obtained a pledge of honor by a unanimous vote from the officers and men under my command to sustain me in performing it. If the assassination of the Smiths was committed by any portion of these, they have added treachery to murder and have done all they could to disgrace the state and sully public honor. On the morning of the day the deed was committed, we had proposed to march the army under my command into Nauvoo. I had, however, discovered on the evening before that nothing but utter destruction of the city would satisfy a portion of the troops, and that if we marched into the city, pretext would not be wanting for commencing hostilities. The Mormons had done everything required, or which ought to have been required of them. Offensive operations on our part would have been as unjust and disgraceful as they would have been impolitic in the present critical season of the year, the harvest and the crops. For these reasons, I decided in a council of officers to disband the army, except 3 companies, 2 of which were reserved as guards for the jail. With the other company, I marched into Nauvoo to address the inhabitants there and tell them what they might expect in case they designedly or imprudently provoked a war. I performed this duty, as I think, plainly and emphatically, and then set out to return to Carthage. When I had marched about 3 miles, a messenger informed me of the occurrences at Carthage. I hastened on to this place. The guard, it is said, did their duty, but were overpowered. Many of the inhabitants of Carthage had fled with their families. Others were preparing to go. I apprehended danger in the settlements from the sudden fury and passion of the Mormons and sanctioned their movements in this respect. General Deming volunteered to remain with the few troops to observe the progress of events, to defend property against small numbers, and with orders to retreat if menaced by a superior force. I decided to proceed immediately to Quincy to prepare a force sufficient to suppress disorders, in case it should ensue from the foregoing transactions or from any other cause. I have hopes that the Mormons will make no further difficulties. In this, I may be mistaken. The other party may not be satisfied. They may recommend aggression. I am determined to preserve the peace against all breakers of the same at all hazards. I think present circumstances warrant the precaution of having competent force at my disposal, in readiness to march at a moment's warning. My position at Quincy will enable me to get the earliest intelligence and to communicate my orders with the greatest clarity. I have decided to issue the following general orders. Headquarters, Quincy, June 29, 1844. It is ordered that the commandants of regiments in the counties of Adams, Marquette, Pike, Brown, Schuyler, Morgan, Scott, Cass, Fulton, and McDonough, and the regiments composing General Staff's brigade will call their respective regiments and battalions together immediately upon the receipt of this order and proceed by voluntary enlistment to enroll as many men as can be armed in their respective regiments. They will make arrangements for a campaign of 12 days and provide themselves with arms, ammunition, and provisions accordingly, and hold themselves in readiness immediately to march upon the receipt of further orders. The dependent companies of riflemen, infantry, cavalry, and artillery in the above-named counties and in the county of Sangamon will hold themselves in readiness in like manner. Signed, Thomas Ford, Governor and Commander-in-Chief." End quote. Hiram and Joseph Smith were dead and buried, but that didn't mean everything that led to their deaths were suddenly over. The anti-Mormons, the old citizens of Hancock County, still wanted the Mormons out of Illinois. The Mormons still wanted to continue flaunting laws and their self-declared sovereign theocracy. Those interests are mutually opposed, and they can't be reconciled. Governor Ford had been the victim of mutiny by multiple state militias. In spite of Joe and Hiram biting the assassins' bullets, Governor Ford had largely gained the trust of the Mormons, but also presumed that civil war was imminent. Willard Richards assumed the primary leadership role in the church with the aid of William Clayton while waiting for the Quorum of Apostles to return from the eastern states. Now, Whiteout Willard Richards was a prudent pro tem leader who advocated for peace and helped the Mormon settlement from spiraling into madness through retaliation. It was late June, and the rest of the leadership wouldn't get news of the gunfight until the second week of July, after which it took them the rest of July into early August to make the journey back to Nauvoo. A conference was held in the first week of August, where the people largely chose to follow Bloody Brigham Young, or a newly discovered charismatic James Strang, who carried a forged letter of succession from the prophet. Hingeman Sidney Rigdon claimed to be the guardian of the church and commanded the people to move to Pittsburgh, and the people rejected him. Rigdon by this time was washed up, and he relied on old systems of public oratory to sway the masses, which failed in comparison to the appealing stability of the Council of Men who, deliberated and who exhibited a solid front for leadership for the church. Thousands of converts who were then living in Nauvoo had been converted as a result of the Quorum of Apostles mission in England, and therefore followed the group of men who converted them and coordinated their immigration to America. It was fairly well understood that the leadership of the church would remain in the Smith family. Should Joe be removed from the office of prophet, his older brother Hiram would inherit the mantle until Joe's oldest son, Joseph III, was of leadership age. Well, Hiram died when Joe died, so that wouldn't work. The last two remaining Smith brothers after the Carthage gunfight were Samuel and William Smith, Crazy Willie as we call him. Samuel was a strong contender for church leadership, but William Smith was generally regarded as a scoundrel, and he was absolutely hated by most of the Mormon leadership, and by a lot of the Mormons too. William Smith posed less of a threat to the Quorum of Apostles than did Samuel. Mother Lucy Mack Smith argued that, quote, Samuel should move into Nauvoo and take the patriarch's office, and says the church ought to support him, end quote. With the support of Mother Lucy Mack Smith, Samuel Smith would gain the support of the Mormon population. So Samuel argued in a July 10th meeting that he was Joseph's designee as president if Joseph and Hiram both died. That's a quote. Well, Willard Richards pushed back against Samuel Smith and successfully argued that any discussions of succession should be postponed until the apostles returned from their missions in the eastern states. A week after this meeting, Samuel Smith came down with an illness. Hosea Stout, a Bloody Brigham loyalist like Willard Richards was, attended Samuel Smith during this illness. Stout did this under the direction of Whiteout Willard Richards. The apostles were still abroad and making their way back to Nauvoo. On July 30th, Samuel Smith died, and Joseph, a loyalist named John M. Bernheisel, wrote a letter to Crazy Willie Smith, who was then in the eastern states in Boston, that the last remaining Smith brother, his third brother, had just been poisoned. Samuel's widow wrote another letter to William Smith that Hosea Stout, quote, had administered a white powder to him daily, end quote. Samuel's brother-in-law, Arthur Milliken, was receiving a similar treatment from Hosea Stout with this white powder and was becoming more and more ill until his wife, Lucy Milliken, Sam's younger sister, threw the powder into the fire, and Arthur recovered soon after. Willard Richards tried to remove every Smith threat after Joe's and Hiram's deaths. William Smith, he was in Boston as all of this happened. He returned to Nauvoo to 3 dead brothers instead of just 2, as well as a nearly dead brother-in-law, Arthur Milliken. While Joe and Hiram were assassinated by anti-Mormons, Samuel Smith was assassinated by Willard Richards to pave the way for Richards' cousin, Bloody Brigham Young, to ascend to president of the church. Now, Whiteout Willard Richards must have known that old adage, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And then mix in some arsenic and then give that lemonade to your enemies. William Smith eventually became the target of Bloody Brigham Young, but he was publicly squeezed out of the leadership of the church. William went on to write an expose of Brigham Young, but that expose kind of fell flat because people had largely decided that Brigham was the rightful successor, the president of the church, the steward of it, and the plans were in the works to already move west. William Smith, Crazy Willie Smith, he would also join the movement of James Strang before publicly apostatizing from Strang's church and writing another expose, which also included Strang's endowment ceremony. Crazy Willie Smith indeed. Now, that last two paragraphs, that covers like 7 years of history, so obviously there's a whole lot more to the story, but, those are stories for another time. So let's turn back to the issues at hand. There was still the mess of the actual gunfight to clean up. Governor Ford was able to keep a lid on his state for another almost a year, while also revoking the Nauvoo City Charter, which disincorporated the city and officially disbanded the Nauvoo Legion, never to gain official state sanction ever again. May of 1845 saw the trial of 5 men involved in the assassination. Now, 9 men were officially indicted, but 4 of them, John Allen, William Voorhees, John Wills, and William Gallagher, those 4 men fled Illinois before they could be arrested and brought to court. A witness claimed that Willis, Gallagher, and Voorhees were the first men who pushed through the door to the apartment, and that Gallagher was the man who shot Joe in the back as he was mounting the windowsill to jump or fall out of the window. Apparently, 3 of these 4 men were also the victims of Joe, firing the pepperbox pistol around the corner of the door blind. Now, the 5 men who did stand trial were Colonel Levi Williams, who was the commanding officer of the men who attacked the jail, Mark Aldrich, who was second in command to Levi Williams, Jacob C. Davis, who was an outspoken political opponent of the Mormons and had repeatedly spoken out about their removal from Illinois, the Mormon extermination, William Grover, a lawyer and militiaman under the command of Levi Williams, and finally, Thomas C. Sharp of the Warsaw Signal, the most outspoken opponent of the Mormons for the past 4 years of Nauvoo history through his paper, the Warsaw Signal. Now, indicting the witnesses was a mess in and of itself. The election of August 1844 caused a stir between the Mormons and the non-Mormons in Hancock County, and Colonel Deming was elected by the Mormons as the new sheriff of Hancock County, with the promise that he would vigorously prosecute those responsible for the Carthage murders. This is the same Colonel Deming who fled Carthage as Levi's men descended on the town because Governor Ford had instructed him to flee if menaced by a superior force. Immediately after this election, Levi Williams and Thomas Sharp fled across the Mississippi into Missouri, and they only returned after Governor Ford made some modest concessions to secure their safety from Mormon vigilantes, retaliation, and promised them a reasonable bail. Governor Ford made these negotiations with Thomas Sharp and Levi Williams, who were, had absconded, had fled. They were fugitives living in Missouri. He made these negotiations with the force of 450 militiamen under his command in Quincy and the threat of an extradition agreement from Governor Reynolds of Missouri. Governor Ford personally oversaw the court proceedings by employing the lawyers to get indictments, to gain testimonies, and to prosecute those who had committed the crime. The Mormon lawyers sought to fill the jury with Mormons and Mormon sympathizers, but they were in a hostile land with a hostile court. On jury selection day, without state sanction, 1,000 men surrounded the courthouse with their guns and barred Mormons from entering the building. Only the men who were selected by this armed anti-Mormon mob surrounding the courthouse were allowed to be on the jury. They, quote, swore that they had never formed or expressed any opinion as to the guilt or innocence of the accused, end quote. However, understandably, all of the men on the jury, they were anti-Mormon sympathizers or anti-Mormons themselves. They planned on acquitting the accused before the jury even heard opening arguments. The Mormons were allowed a single witness, William Daniels. And Daniels, he had been at Carthage that day. We read from his account earlier. But because the Mormon leadership wanted to fill the press with their propaganda, Daniels' account of the Carthage gunfight had been so corrupted by unbelievable events that his account ended up being a detriment to the prosecution. The Mormon leadership made the mistake of printing Daniels' account complete with full of falsehoods and propaganda as a pamphlet just 2 weeks before the trial, which forced William Daniels to stick to that propagandized and legendary story that was in that pamphlet when he was called as a witness, and that completely crippled the prosecution's case against the 5 men. Here's from Governor Ford, quote, "But before the trial came on, they had induced Daniels to become a Mormon, and being much more anxious for the glorification of the prophet than to avenge his death, the leading Mormons made him publish a pamphlet giving an account of the murder, in which he professed to have seen a bright and shining light descend upon the head of Joe Smith, to strike some of the conspirators with blindness, and that he heard supernatural voices in the air confirming his mission as a prophet. Having published this in a book, he was compelled to swear to it in court, which of course destroyed the credit of his evidence. This witness was afterwards expelled from the Mormons, but no doubt they will cling to his evidence in favor of the divine mission of the prophet." End quote. So the way that Governor Ford reports that, Daniels joined the Mormons, he gave this account, and then he left the Mormons, it almost seems like the leadership under Bloody Brigham Young at this point bought this guy's testimony, which also wouldn't be a surprise. There is more possible evidence for this, because Daniels didn't live in Nauvoo until like 7 weeks before the trial and his pamphlet was published, but he was never counted as a Mormon after the trial. He was basically a tool of the Mormons. Maybe some listeners can empathize with that. Regardless, Ford was right, because the folklore of the kid trying to cut off Joe's head and then being scared by a flash of light, that's still legend known by most Mormons today, even though that legend was obviously a complete fabrication that destroyed the prosecution's case against the assassins. The church even includes this propaganda today in their essay about the Carthage martyrdom, even though that story served to be the greatest weakness to the state's prosecution of those who actually committed the crime. Regardless, a number of witnesses were called in to determine the facts, but the verdict was already decided before the people even stepped foot in that courthouse. Now, some interesting information did emerge from the trial, and we won't go through the entire thing here, but as Governor Ford observed, quote, "Many other witnesses were examined who knew the facts, but under the influence of the demoralization of faction, denied all knowledge of them." End quote. Every witness and indicted suspect took the stand, and they denied that they had anything to do with the assassins or anything leading up to it, and oftentimes even contradicting their own statements. They testified they had no knowledge of the other suspects even being there, that there was no collusion, and that they had no idea what was going to happen that day when they got to Carthage. They all just lied because everybody was under the control of the far superior anti-Mormon faction in the area. Governor Ford observes, quote, "During the progress of these trials, the judge was compelled to permit the courthouse to be filled and surrounded by armed bands who attended the court to browbeat and overawe the administration of justice. The judge himself was in duress and informed me that he did not consider his life secure at any part of the time." End quote. It was clearly a charged case, right? The anti-Mormons successfully got every Mormon thrown off of the jury, intimidated the judge, and then filled the courthouse with cheers and boos depending on what each witness said and what bearing that information had on incriminating the suspects. Governor Ford, quote, "The consequence was that the crowd had everything their own way. The lawyers for the defense defended their clients by a long and elaborate attack on the governor. The armed mob stamped with their feet and yelled their approbation at every sarcastic and smart thing that was said, and the judge was not only forced to hear it, but to lend it a kind of approval." End quote. As a result of all of this, the jury deliberated for 2 hours and they delivered a verdict of not guilty. All 5 men were acquitted, and the outstanding warrants for their arrest of the other 4 men were stricken. How do you charge a mob with murder? You don't. You can't. You can't do it, at least not in this case. But notably, a few months later, there was a separate hearing to determine the criminality of the Mormon leaders for destroying the Nauvoo Expositor printing press. And they were also acquitted by these same methods. The Mormons filled the jury, they intimidated the witnesses and the judge, and they were all acquitted of the charges of destroying the Nauvoo Expositor. Justice wasn't served on the Mormons or on the anti-Mormons because this was mob law and an era of American jurisprudence which didn't have enough weight prosecuting systemic crimes like this. It wasn't until, the casino-owning mafias in Vegas were prosecuted in the 1950s and 60s that we formulated the conspiracy charges necessary to eradicate hierarchical crime as we saw in Nauvoo and with obviously with the anti-Mormons fighting Nauvoo criminality. But let's go through some of the court record. And this was taken in Pittman shorthand by George D. Watt, an incredible resource for Bloody Brigham Young in Utah. If only Joe recognized how useful George D. Watt was before he died, we might have a lot more of Joe's actual words to work with today. I digress. The prosecution, Josiah Lamborn, opened up with the charges on behalf of the state. Quote,
"You are here called upon to judge a truly extraordinary case. It is extraordinary on account of the peculiar celebrity of the person killed and on account of the peculiar circumstances attending the killing of this man, and that has attended the whole account through this country and adjoining country. The case is one of peculiar interest and vast importance to the whole country. To it, public attention is directed from every part. The eyes of the whole country is upon us. It has not only excited a feeling of considerable interest among the people of the United States, but throughout the civilized world. A citizen of your county was confined in jail under the protection of the law, and plighted faith of the governor of the state as to how far his offenses are true or far they are false. He may have been guilty of the basest crimes, or he may have been innocent of the charges alleged against him. About these things I know nothing. But he has suffered an awful atonement for any offense he might have committed, and is gone to answer for it before his God. He being confined in jail, a reckless mob came here on these peaceable prairies and took that man from jail and murdered him. But the laws of mobocracy not having the laws of God and man in their favor, we allege that these men arraigned before you at the bar are the men who knew the movers, the instigators of that mob, and committed the crime, and shed blood upon the soil of your town. They were the cause of the spilling of that blood, in consequence of which murder rests upon their hands and hearts of these 5 men here arraigned. It is not necessary to prove that these men entered the jail or shot the gun or any of these instruments by which his death was accomplished in order to convict them, but that the mob got its spirit, impulse, movements, and bloodthirstiness from the minds and dispositions of these men, and that they were the instigators of that mob, gave countenance to it, and that they did stir up others to commit the murder. We shall be able to fully and substantially prove. There are hundreds here, I have no doubt, are ready to applaud you and rejoice with you if you should return a verdict of not guilty against these men. But as you respect your honor, your country, and your God, I call upon you to do justice to this case, for this state of things cannot exist much longer. The law must prevail. Mobs may triumph for a short time, but the law will ultimately prevail and triumph. The guilt of this crime hangs over you as a blight and a curse which is destroying your character and gnawing at the root of your prosperity. It is a blood stain upon your character and a foul blot which cannot be erased, but with vengeance and rigor to deal out the law as the law is. As you respect and fear your God and not men, do your duty, for it is better that truth and righteousness prevail, and that even-handed justice be dealt out the full, than to suffer the guilty to go free and escape the merited punishment due their deeds. Where are your laws here in this country? Where the protection that ought to be thrown around your persons if such violations are to be committed as they have been? You are not sure but that yourselves may be the next victim. You are now interested in the welfare of your country. The laws of your country demand such an interest, and you are not the only ones that feels this interest, but as far as the name of liberty, religion, the rights of conscience, and the power of the divine providence is extended, there will be interest manifested in this examination of this case. Therefore, it is for you to know and consider well your duty, and make your decision according to the dictates of truth and a pure conscience. Remember that these oaths you have made is registered in illegible, and you will be called upon to answer the manner in which you have determined this case between the state and these individuals for taking the blood of that man against the laws of God and against your own human laws that govern the laws in which you live." End quote. The defense responded with their opening statement from Colonel Richardson. Quote, You have heard the indictment read in which is contained the charge alleged against these defendants. The case is one of vast importance inasmuch as it jeopardizes the lives of these individuals. You are set to judge this case, and upon your decision hang their destiny. The prosecutor for the people has endeavored to work upon your feelings, and as much as possible prejudice you against these men. But between the prosecutor for the people and these defendants, we have to say that a verdict has not yet either for or against them, and that it can only be done after the case is tried, and the evidence heard on both sides. But Mr. Lambourne would have you believe that they are guilty of the charge contained in the indictment before they are tried. The people have that to prove yet upon evidence, but they will fail, and fail most signally, to produce before you such evidence as to render a verdict of guilty. But if we may judge of the guilt or innocence of these defendants by clamorous report, or by their conduct and deportment in general, we have the most decided evidence of their innocence. We have seen no manifestations on their part to evade a trial and escape from justice, but as soon as the indictment was found against them, they presented themselves to the bar of the court for trial, that they might be acquitted from the charge according to law. That they have also insisted upon having a trial, the last term of the court, and they are now come again voluntarily to be tried, and patiently wait the decision of the law. All this time, this charge is hung over their heads. Their names have gone to the world, carrying with them the alleged infamy and crime. They have expected, as they still expect, to gear all this clamorous noise to go forth, but the complaintives will be most signally refuted, and the public opinion corrected by the testimony that shall be addressed and by the law. When the testimony is heard, we expect them to discuss the testimony and the law, and it will be for you to render your verdict according to that testimony and that law." End quote. So what followed these opening statements was a farce. Each witness testified that each defendant wasn't there, or that they didn't see any of the defendants in the chaos of the day. All of these men lied to protect each other and to ensure mob law and vigilante justice carried the day. A few exchanges from Jonas Hobart. And then, of course, this is court of law. It's question and answer. From Jonas Hobart, quote, "Did you see anybody there beside yourself?" "I saw a great crowd of people there." "Did you see any that you knew?" "I did not." "Did you see any of these defendants there?" "No." "How many people were there?" "I suppose about 150. "Did you see any in disguise there?" "I did not." "Are you acquainted with any of the men on this trial?" "I am." "Did you see any of them at the jail?" "I did not." Here's John Patton. "Was Sharp there when you was discharged?" "I don't think he was." "How far from Warsaw was you when you was discharged?" "We was 5 or 6 miles." "Was David, Aldridge, and Williams there when the company was discharged?" "I think they were." "Was Grover there?" "He was somewhere there, illegible." "Sharp also?" "I did not see Sharp there." "What time of day was you discharged?" "Near 12 o'clock." "Did you hear any of these men address the people upon anything?" "I did." "Who addressed the people?" "I think Thomas Sharp made a small speech." "Did you watch any of the speech?" "I recollect some portion of it." "Did he say anything about Joseph Smith?" The court notes, the witness waited some considerable time before he answered. Then he answered with this: "I think he said that Joe Smith was now in custody, and the Mormons would elect the officers of the county, and by that means Joe would select his own jury and get free." "Was anything said about killing Joseph Smith?" "No." "Did he say what should be done with him?" "No." Another interesting detail emerges from a few of these testimonies, and it points to possible complicity by Governor Ford. This is an exchange from John with the witness John Patton. "What was the words Sharp used?" "He said the Mormons had the power to elect the officers of the county, and that Joe would select his own jurors and be set free." "Did he say anything more?" "Yes, but I don't recollect all his speech." "He said Joe would select the officers of the county, did he?" "He did." "Did he say anything more that you remember?" "He said the governor had said whatever they do, to do it quickly." Okay, so let's deal with that. Whatever you do, do it quickly. Spoken under oath from the stand by somebody
whose testimony contained plenty of problems like most of these other witnesses, but that is still notable. Whether or not Governor Ford said such a thing, whatever you do, do it quickly. It can't be concluded from this statement. If he said that or anything alluding to vigilante justice, that's troubling, that's possible, but we can't be sure. Never forget, there are no heroes in this story. Here's another witness, Mr. Backman. Quote, "How long was it before the firing that you saw Mr. Levi Williams?" "I saw Williams going in the line of march up to the jail." "Did you see Williams after they returned from the jail?" "No, I was called on as a juryman immediately after." "Did you see Williams immediately after with Wilson speaking about the killing?" "No, sir." "Did you see Sharp there that evening after the killing?" "No." "Did you see Grover there that evening after the killing?" "No." "Did you see Davis here that evening?" "No." Okay, you get the idea. Each of these guys lied and lied and lied to protect each other. No honor among assassins, and the rule of law had long been dispensed with before this trial was even called. But one exchange from the hearing I want to highlight. It comes from the testimony of Frank Worrell. Now, Frank Worrell, he was the teenage guard of the jail who allegedly colluded with Levi Williams to fire blank rounds at the attacking militia to give Frank Worrell and his fellow guards plausible deniability. This is a bit of a long read, but it's super important to hear how it all transpired and to understand the consequences that followed the trial. Quote, Mr. Worrell sworn, "Did you see Smith where he was killed?" "I did." "Did you see any of these 5 men there?" "I did not." "How many men was there at the time Smith was killed?" "I could not say, but I suppose from 1 to 200. "How long did they stay?" "I suppose 3 or 4 minutes. "What did they do when they first came?" "The first motion was to come up in front of the jail, and when they got formed there, they made a rush for the door." "Did many go upstairs?" "I could not say." "Was Smith shot in a number of places?" "I cannot say. I never examined the body." "Did you see anybody there you knew after the deed was done?" "I did not." "Was there a good deal of confusion?" "There was." "Did you hear anything said?" "I cannot say. The pieces were going off all the time so that I could not either see nor hear anything said." "Where was you when they made the rush to the door?" "I was at the door." "Then you stood in the door?" "No, I was sitting on the doorstep when the men came up." "Did you change your position?" I was pushed and, illegible, about 50 feet in the crowd." "Did you see Smith when he died?" "I did." "How long did he live after he fell?" "Not to exceed a minute after he struck the ground." "Did you see him hanging in the window?" "I did not." "You saw him die?" "I did." "What time in the evening was it?" "Between 5 and 6 o'clock." "Did you see Levi Williams there?" "I do not recollect. I'm satisfied I did not see him there." "Was he in town?" "He was." "Was Grover here?" "I did not see him." "Was Davis here?" "I did not see him." "You saw Williams and Aldridge both here that evening?" I think I did." "You are acquainted with almost everybody in this county?" "I suppose I am acquainted with about 1/3. "And there was between 100 to 150 people there, and you did not know a single one?" No, there was such a hurry I could not tell who was there." He retired. The court record continues because the cross-examination wanted to call Franklin Worrell back up. The court record says, Franklin Worrell, captain of the guard that was at the jail when the mob came up, was again called to the witness box by Squire Lamborn, that's the prosecution, to ask him questions that were before omitted. Mr. Browning for the defense stood up in opposition to his asking him any further questions, which caused an investigation of the law upon the subject, which lasted some time, but illegible, was finally decided by the court that Mr. Lamborn have the privilege with strict injunctions upon the witness not to answer any questions that would implicate himself. So this is the prosecution trying to charge these guys with murder here. This is his line of questioning to Franklin Worrell. "Mr. Worrell, do you know if the Carthage Greys that evening loaded their guns with blank cartridge?"
At this question, Mr. Browning and Mr. Richardson spoke out to the witness, saying, "You need not answer that question." I know nothing about the Carthage Greys, only the 6 men that I had to do with." "Well, do those 6 men load their guns with blank cartridges that evening?" "I will not answer it." "Let it go to the county there in that way that he would not answer the question for fear of implicating himself. Retired." End quote. Franklin Worrell, the 19-year-old with a stutter, denied that any of the defendants were in the mob. Then he couldn't remember a single face in the crowd. He saw Joe die, but he didn't see Joe hanging out of the window. And then he claimed that he knows a third of the people in the county, but not a single person in the mob struck him as familiar. But that final bit is really important. He refused to answer the direct question, after this was objected to by his counsel, of whether or not he loaded his gun with blank cartridges to make a show of defending the jail against Levi Williams's men. The attorney for the defense, they objected to him even being asked the question, and after the court decided that the prosecution could ask him that in cross-examination, he still refused to implicate himself by answering that blank cartridge question. This was the largest scandal of the entire hearing, and Franklin Worrell was held accountable, but not by the law, but by the destroying angel of Mormonism, Orrin Pistolpack and Porter Rockwell. Porter Rockwell, childhood friend of Joseph Smith, had the name of Frank Worrell etched into his mind when Rockwell met George Grant, who conveyed the news to Port, the death of Joe's, the news of Joe's death, telling Port that Franklin Worrell was guarding the jail at that time. And then Porter made his famous midnight ride through Nauvoo. They killed him, goddamn him. They killed Joseph. Porter Rockwell never let the name Franklin Worrell escape his mind. From John Hay, quote, "This jolly good-natured Worrell was himself murdered by Mormon assassins not long after. He was riding with a friend. A shot was heard from the thicket. 'That was a rifle,' said his friend. 'Yes, and I've got it,' said Worrell coolly. He fell from his horse and died. I have seen as a child his grave at Warsaw, a rude wooden headboard bearing this legend: 'He who is without enemies is unworthy of friends.' Not very orthodox, but perhaps as true as most epitaphs." End quote. So by the end of 1845, when Porter Rockwell murdered Frank Worrell out of retribution, the Nauvoo charter was revoked. The Mormon settlement of Yelrum had been burned to the ground. The mob would march into Nauvoo and remove the few remaining Mormons in September of 1846. Only mob law ruled the area. Now, the Legion may have been officially disbanded, but that didn't stop Bloody Brigham Young from mustering the Nauvoo Legion when occasion required, armed with some repeating rifles from Jonathan Browning. Yes, that Browning, the same Browning that made my shotgun. Jonathan Browning started gunsmithing in Nauvoo, and some of the earliest rifles that Browning ever made bear a plaque reading "Holiness to the Lord," which is also on every temple. I want one of those Nauvoo Legion Browning guns. I want one so bad. I want one more than a Flying Miata turbo kit, which is to say, like, more than I want my next meal, or like a heartfelt letter from my parents telling me that they read letter from my wife and that they're wrong about everything. Like, okay. I can dare to dream. I'm doing fine. Everything's fine. Stop asking. So with all that aside, Governor Ford recognized the increased lawlessness with both of the Mormons and the anti-Mormons after both of these trials, with prosecuting the witnesses and the assassins for the Carthage jail shootout, as well as who were acquitted, as well as the people who were responsible for burning the Nauvoo Expositor printing press being acquitted by the Mormon jury. He understood that this was only going to spiral further out of control. Quote, "No one would be convicted of any crime in Hancock County, and this put an end to the administration of the criminal law in that distracted county. Government was at an end there, and the whole community were delivered up to the dominion of a frightful anarchy. The people were neither capable of governing themselves nor of being governed by others. And truly, there can be no government in a free country where the people do not voluntarily obey the laws." End quote.
And now to some broader observations by Governor Ford on the Mormon movement as a whole. And this is another long read from a guy that's been dead for, over a century and a half. But Governor Ford's understanding of the situation is very Twain-esque, and it's absolutely timeless, as well as oddly prophetic. From the History of Illinois, quote, "The world now indulged in various conjectures as to the further progress of the Mormon religion. By some persons, it was believed that it would perish and die away with its founder. But upon the principle that the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church, there was now really more cause than ever to predict its success. The murder of the Smiths, instead of putting an end to the delusion of the Mormons and dispersing them, as many believed it would, only bound them together closer than ever, gave them new confidence in their faith and an increased fanaticism. The Mormon Church had been organized with a first presidency, composed of Joe and Hiram Smith and Sidney Rigdon, and 12 apostles of the prophet, representing the apostles of Jesus Christ. 12 apostles were now absent, and until they could be called together, the minds of the saints were unsettled as to the future government of the church. Revelations were published that the prophet, in imitation of the Savior, was to rise again from the dead. Many were looking in gaping wonderment for the fulfillment of this revelation, and some reported that they had already seen him, attended by a celestial army coursing the air on a great white horse. Rigdon, as the only remaining member of the first presidency, claimed the government of the church as being successor to the prophet. When the 12 apostles returned from foreign parts, a fierce struggle for power ensued between them and Rigdon. Rigdon fortified his pretensions by alleging the will of the prophet in his favor and pretending to have several new revelations from heaven, amongst which was one of a very impolitic nature. This was to the effect that all the wealthy Mormons were to break up their residence at Nauvoo and follow him to Pittsburgh. This revelation put both the rich and poor against him. The rich because they did not want to leave their property, and the poor because they would not be deserted by the wealthy. This was fatal to the ambition of Rigdon, and the Mormons, tired of the despotism of a one-man government, were now willing to decide in favor of the apostles. Rigdon was expelled from the church as being a false prophet and left the field with a few followers to establish a little delusion of his own near Pittsburgh, leaving the government of the main church in the hands of the apostles, with Brigham Young, a cunning but vulgar man at their head, occupying the place of Peter in the Christian hierarchy. Missionaries were dispatched to all parts to preach in the name of the martyr Joseph, and the Mormon religion thrived more than ever. For a while, it was doubtful whether the reign of the military saints in Nauvoo would not, in course of time, supplant the meek and lowly system of Christ. There were many things to favor their success. The different Christian sects had lost much of the fiery energy by which at first they were animated. They had attained to a more subdued, sober, learned, and intellectual religion. But there is at all times a large class of mankind who will never be satisfied with anything in devotion short of a heated and wild fanaticism. The Mormons were the greatest zealots, the most confident in their faith, and filled with a wilder, fiercer, and more enterprising enthusiasm than any sect on the continent of America. Their religion gave promise of more temporal and spiritual advantages for less labor and with less personal sacrifice of passion, lust, prejudice, malice, hatred, and ill will than any other perhaps in the whole world. Their missionaries abroad, to the number of 2,000 or 3,000, were more earnest and indefatigable in their efforts to make converts, compassing sea and land to make one proselyte. When abroad, they first preached doctrines somewhat like those of the Campbellites, Sidney Rigdon, the inventor of the system, having once been a Campbellite preacher, and when they had made a favorable impression, they began in far-off allusions to open up their mysteries and to reveal to their disciples that a perfect fullness of the gospel must be expected. This fullness of the gospel was looked for by the dreamy and wondering disciple as an indefinite something not yet to be comprehended, but which was essential to complete happiness and salvation. He was then told that God required him to remove to the place of gathering, where alone this sublime fullness of the gospel could be revealed and completely enjoyed. When he arrived at the place of gathering, he was fortified in the new faith by being withdrawn from all other influence, and by seeing and hearing nothing but Mormons and Mormonism, and by association with those only who never doubted any of the Mormon dogmas. Now the fullness of the gospel could be safely made known. If it required him to submit to the most intolerable despotism, if it tolerated and encouraged the lusts of the flesh and a plurality of wives, if it claimed all the world for the saints, universal dominion for the Mormon leaders, if it sanctioned murder, robbery, perjury, and larceny at the command of their priests, no one could now doubt but that this was the fullness of the gospel, the liberty of the saints with which Christ had made them free. The Christian world, which has hitherto regarded Mormonism with silent contempt, unhappily may yet have cause to fear its rapid increase. Modern society is full of material for such a religion. At the death of the prophet, 14 years after the first Mormon church was organized, the Mormons in all the world numbered about 200,000 souls, 500,000 according to their statistics, a number equal perhaps to the number of Christians when the Christian church was of the same age. It is to be feared that in the course of a century, some gifted man like Paul, some splendid orator, who will be able by his eloquence to attract crowds of the thousands who are ever ready to hear and be carried away by the sounding brass and tinkling cymbal of sparkling oratory, may command a hearing, may succeed in breathing a new life into this modern Mahometanism, and make the name of the martyr Joseph ring as loud and stir the souls of men as much as the almighty name of Christ itself. Sharon, Palmyra, Manchester, Kirtland, Far West, Adamond-Ioman, Ramus, Nauvoo, and the Carthage jail may become holy and venerable names, places of classic interest in another age, like Jerusalem, the Garden of Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives, and Mount Calvary to the Christian, and Mecca and Medina to the Turk. And in the event, the author of this history feels degraded by the reflection that the humble governor of an obscure state, who would otherwise be forgotten in a few years, stands a fair chance, like Pilate and Herod, by their official connection with the true religion, of being dragged down to posterity with an immortal name, hitched on to the memory of a miserable impostor. There may be those whose ambition would lead them to desire an immortal name in history, even in those humbling terms. I am not one of that number. From my own personal knowledge of this people, I can say with truth that I have never known much of any of their leaders who was not addicted to profane swearing. No other kind of discourses than these were heard in the city. Curses upon their enemies, upon the country, upon government, upon all public officers were now the lessons taught by the elders, to inflame their people with the highest degree of spite and malice against all who were not of the Mormon church or its obsequious tools. The reader can readily imagine how a city of 15,000 inhabitants could be wrought up and kept in a continual rage by the inflammatory harangues of its leaders. End quote. Timeless and prophetic observations. Bravo, Sir Thomas Ford. All right, listeners. I appreciate all of you sticking around for this really long episode to round out our series. And I've prepared a conclusion, not just of the Road to Carthage series, but also some of my takeaways from the historical timeline. It's hard to quantify, 6 years and a lot of research in a conclusion, but I'm going to try to do my best. But first, some acknowledgments as well as announcements. Let's start with announcements. As most of you know, I'm going away for a while. I'm still going to be on Glassbox Podcast every 2 weeks because it feels like a mistake to have a platform in 2020 and not discuss current events, but this show, Naked Mormonism, is going on hiatus. Here's what that means for the wonderful people who support the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. I'm not going to charge you during the hiatus, but you can expect periodic updates on that exclusive feed. It's late 2020. I know that money is a tough issue for a lot of people right now, so I'm not taking your money until we're officially off hiatus. So if you listening right now, you listener, if you want to join the Patreon feed and get all of the extra content, that's extra episodes, extra interviews, Namo Home Evenings, early Mormon audiobooks with my commentary, extended editions of most episodes, and just tons of goodies, during this hiatus is a great time to get all of that extra content for free. Patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Speaking of Glassbox Podcast, If you want some merch, that's a great way to support the show as well. We have mugs, t-shirts, stickers, all kinds of cool stuff in the shop section at glassboxpodcast.com. Next announcement, and this comes in the form of a massive thank you to listener and friend of the show, Jeff Anderson. Jeff and I have been working together for the past couple of months to get all of the show notes from the entire backlog posted onto the website. Simply go to scripts.nakedmormonismpodcast.com, where you can view all of the scripts for the show notes, and you can listen to each episode, and you can add comments or any corrections that you have in the comment box at the bottom of each page. There's also a search function. So once again, without the help of Jeff Anderson, posting all of the show notes for the podcast would never have been possible. And he's also a longtime supporter of the show. So thank you so much, Jeff Anderson. Once again, scripts.nakedmormonismpodcast.com. You'll find a link to it in the show notes, as well as a special post of it on the Patreon exclusive feed. Next announcement, we're doing a final live Q&A this upcoming 200th anniversary of the First Vision Day. That's September 21st, 2020 at 6 p.m. Pacific time. So if you have comments or thoughts or questions from the historical timeline or the Road to Carthage series specifically, post up a question on the Patreon feed or tag Naked Mormonism on your social medias of choice, and I'll answer those questions or respond to those on that YouTube live broadcast. This is going to be the final Nemo Home Evening Q&A to kick off the hiatus. Once again, September 21st, 2020 at 6 p.m. Pacific time. Final announcement, I re-recorded the first episode of this show to reflect the research and writing style that I've developed since the last time that it was recorded, as well as kind of provide a general directory to the backlog. So with this 10-part Road to Carthage series and episode 1 being re-released, there's never been a better time to recommend the podcast to a friend. And the more that y'all do that, the less marketing stuff that I have to do, which is great because I'm really bad at marketing. So with all that said, I'm not sure how long hiatus is going to be. So one more unashamed plug, patrons at patreon.com/nakedmormonism will get periodic updates, and anybody who signs up during the hiatus gets all of the bonus Patreon exclusive content for free. This podcast would never have become what it is today if not for an army of amazing folks who have helped me every step of the journey. In no particular order, I owe a massive debt of gratitude to all of the following people. And yes, it's a pretty long list, and it's far from exhausted, but the list is pretty long because I'm a hefty boy, and it takes a lot of shoulders to carry me around. So thank you to Preston, Hal Prentice, Jay Mumford, Julie Briscoe, Noah, Eli, Heath, Lucinda, Thomas Cecil, Andrew Torres, David Michael, Marie Kent, Matthew Giltner, Cash, Rachel Nannon Brown, Professor Stephen, Judy Cottrell, Kurt, Philip Saulnier, Eric Johnson, Cody Nakoni, Brian Kassenbrock, Doug Hoffling, Mark Hoffling, Dan Beecher, Lynn Howard, Jared Rowley, Dan Weiss, Lane, Andrew Lindeman, Joe Mrack, Tim Heaton, Heather and Brandon King, James R. Wharton, Jim Dobler, Darren Bennett, Aaron Gleason, James Redcop, Doubting Dogma, Amy Larson, Jeannie, Mars Girl, Jonathan Tyndall, Abe Gardner, Roy Kazier, Rob Rigby and the whole Rigby family, Marion Shelley, Josh Kim, Joel Kuhn, Rebecca Fakima, Katie Langston, Tim Burt, Perry Porter, Will M., Eric Herman, Levi Clausen, Tanner Barker, Jeff Peterson, Sarah Ward, George Nash, Dennis Anderson, Darren Schaefer, Dread Pirate, Jessica Outbeer, Dave and Shay, Shannon Grover, Mike Hunt, Josh Wood, Chris and Christy McRoberts, Greg Gibson, Shane Toon, Frank Frost, George Green, Tim and Clara Kite, Darth Mandypants, Bevan Flynn, Chuck Simons, maybe Simmons, I can't remember, Chuck Simmons, Misty Dawn, N.A. Johnson, Ryan Colans, Blake Wright, Tanner Gilliland, Samantha Shelley, John DeLynn, John Larson, Colleen Dietz, Ryan McKnight, Ethan Dodge, Seth Andrews, Leslie Butterfield, Joseph Geisner, Sherry and Bill Moraine, Rachel Killebrew, Cheryl Grinter, Jill Brim, Barbara Brown, Robert Beckstead, Michael Winkleman, Don Bradley, Vicky Speak, Braden Ham, Lindsay Park, Christina Rossetti, Brian Ziegenhagen, Brent and Aaron Metcalf, Alice Ashton, Callie Wright, Sharon Frankel, Billy Eason, Jenica Crail, Mike Marquardt, Dan Vogel, Cheryl Bruno, Matt Harris, Trace Rogers, Jason Camo, David Fitzgerald, Cara Santa Maria, Caitlin McKenna, Sean Jolly, Sean McCraney, Adam Gonerman, Esther Palmer, John Hamer, Seth Bryant, Diane and Bill Shepard, Roy Jeffs, Heretic Woman, Deborah McTaggart, Sam Young, Lydia Finch, Kimberly Anderson, Kate Kelly, Benjamin Schaefer, Marissa McCool, David Salisbury, Gene Aldrich, Tyson Kidder, Tom Kimball, Tim Corey, Jimmy Snow, Godless Engineer, Shirley Draper, Miles Germer, Greg Ratty, Randy Todd Lamonda, Ishmael Brown, Dario Alvarez, Jill Brim, Julie Thomas, Jason Smith, Mark Elwood, Brian Buchanan, Jonathan Streeter, Jana Reese, Grace Poole, Thomas Smith, Wayne Hepworth, Stacy Rebrel, Beth Hambridge, Zach Law, Morgan Stringer, Glenn Osland, Deb Diner, Alan Piper, Bonnie Reckner, Rick Hansen, Will Bagley, Christine Marie, D. Michael Quinn, Jeremy Runnels, Phil Ferguson, Natalie Newell, Raven, Lilith Starr, Claire Barris, Johnny Stevenson, Michael Marshall, Andy Wilson, Josue Mejia, Gazalem, Joseph Johnston, Galen Vorwalder, Curtis Evans, The Atlanta Atheist, Mark Doucette, Georgie Ivanov, Pup Dahlia, Jason Kendall, Jennifer Cantrell, Stephen Deem, Chris Barton, Daniel Spencer, Jim Van Heel, Duke of Earl Grey, Devery Anderson, Kimberly Galaxy, Joey Scoma, Jessica and Andrew Sprague, Daniel Stone, Amy Cool, Jake Farr Wharton, Celia Gray, David Connolly Nelson, Dane Dawson, Andrea L. Rice, Randy and Jana Woodward, John Peden, Zena Gresham, Gene Elliott, Tyler Meesom, Craig Criddle, Brian Keith Dalton, Bobby Carey and Miss Ashley, The Prophet Jeremiah, Bill Reel, and the longer I think, the longer the list gets, so I'm just going to cap it there. That list is far from exhaustive, and I know that there are so many people that I missed, so if I didn't call out your name, just know that I appreciate you as well. Each of these people has been instrumental somehow in my journey the past 6 years of doing the podcast. I also want to take special note of Christopher C. Smith. He's the historian that I hired to help put together and organize all of my research into this final Road to Carthage series, and he's been an immense help in many ways beyond these final 10 episodes. Thank you, Chris. I'm also uploading the 213 pages of Carthage jail sources that Chris compiled for this series on scripts.nakedmormonismpodcast.com website. I also want to thank my amazing partner, Annie Ross. We met and we started dating while I was mulling around the idea of starting a podcast, and she even listened to the first episodes and gave the necessary feedback of, this sucks. So from that point forward, I knew that I had a winner, and I'm so lucky now to be her lifelong partner. Annie has been so supportive and instrumental to this journey, and she's taught me more about life than any other person. Thank you. And finally, hundreds of hours of broadcast, thousands of pages of script, 6 years of time and nearly 3 million downloads. And you amazing listeners have been there every step of the way. My biggest thanks goes out to each and every one of you who hit the download button every single week. All right, listeners. Let's bring this to a wrap with a conclusion. I have some thoughts about what happened in Carthage, as well as some general thoughts overall about Joseph Smith and Mormonism. So let's start with the death of Joseph Smith. How does somebody deal with a person like Joseph Smith? A figure like him never simply goes away, nor do the systems that he creates. If the Mormons faced another exile under his leadership, it would merely be, pushing off the Mormon theocracy problem a few more years to a different location, and then the Mormons would take all of the lessons that they learned in Missouri and Nauvoo and make their next settlement all the more powerful and untouchable. And that's an important word, untouchable. Joseph Smith, legally speaking, had constructed his fiefdom such that he was untouchable by the legal system. How does a legal system rein in such flagrant abuses? When Joe had escaped that legal system so many times, what could it do? He was too powerful. What could the people acting out of goodwill in the legal system do to touch somebody who was untouchable?
When I take a look at Joe's plans, his ability to navigate the legal system, and all of his power and everything that he intended to do to the world in his Mormon revolution, all of the damage and human cost attendant with revolutions, the freedoms stolen by a theocracy, the devastation that he planned on wreaking upon an ever-expanding scope of victims of his criminal empire. When I take all of these trends and forces into account, I can only view Joseph Smith with complete and utter contempt, disgust, and reprehension. Deplorable, abominable, vile, and absolutely loathsome. He was a tyrant of heinous and revolting proportions. By the legal standards of the day, Joseph Smith should have been executed via court-martial in 1838, after he had surrendered at the end of the Missouri Mormon War. He acted in open defiance to the government of Missouri. He acted out of pure contempt for federal government authority. He sat atop a criminal empire which committed robbery and murder and larceny at a systemic level. And he used that empire with his own militia to wage war against the government. He committed treason. If a military officer in any era of American history ever did what Joe did, they'd be killed on the spot after an unceremonious court-martial. By every legal standard, whether civilian or military, Joseph Smith rightfully faced the gallows or firing squad. The legality of the situation is separate, however, from the moral judgment. Joe presents a very complicated rendition of the trolley problem. That problem was solved for us by Levi Williams and his men on June 27, 1844. But the moment before that decision was made for history, what consequences could we tease out of the situation had Joseph Smith not died that day? This forces us to stare down the barrel of alternative history, speculative history, which isn't something that historians engage in often because infinite variables could easily change any possible outcome in unforeseeable ways. If he didn't die on June 27th, how much more suffering and death would he have caused? If he was able to carry out his grand designs to any extent, how many people would have died in his warpath during the Mormon Revolution of America and the rest of the world? How many people would have been forced into slavery of all kinds because no empire has ever been constructed without the subsistence of slave labor? Undoubtedly, Joe's new empire in the West, once Nauvoo became untenable, would have been far more dangerous in a criminal theocratic regime. If the suffering of the Mormons in Missouri and Nauvoo is a pattern we could carry on to this hypothetical fourth Josephite Mormon settlement, tens of thousands of people would have suffered from abuse and from illness. Crime would have run completely out of control. Counterfeiting operations would have been expanded. The Mormons themselves would have been driven to the brink of collapse, and wounded animals are always the most dangerous. Think of how polygamy would have expanded as well. If the most salacious exposés of how women were treated in the sex work ring at Nauvoo are to be trusted, thousands of women would have been caught up in this oppressed and subjugated state, living off of crumbs, just tools for servicing rampant male sexual gratification, abused, broken, traumatized, and ultimately to be discarded for younger generations of sex workers in an endless cycle of abuse and sex slavery. Under a Mormon theocratic government, religious compliance would be required. Apostates would disappear, shipped off by train cars to gulags and camps. The 50-50 population split of men and women would force a significant percentage of young men to be castrated so as to allow the religious government officials enough wives. The Lost Boys that we see from fundamentalist Mormon communities today would be an entire social caste. Property of the Gentiles across the world would be plundered and absorbed into the church-run bishops' storehouses, as modern Labans and Nephis would see the aggressor as the hero in these conflicts. Anybody who dared call themselves an atheist or stand up to this religious tyranny in any way would be labeled a Korihor, after which their tongues would be ripped out, they'd be cast from civilization, and they'd meet their untimely end by citizens trampling them to death. Anybody seeking a change of government from the Mormon theocracy would be labeled a kingman, and following the example of General Moroni, the Book of Mormon's most dangerous fascist, those dissenters would be placed in prison camps and ultimately burned alive to set an example to anybody, entertaining tendencies of dissent. The Book of Mormon is truly a horrific book, and millions of people call it truth. All that horrific shit is in there, and Mormons are encouraged to apply scripture to their everyday lives.
This draconian system of religious thought policing would be enforced by bishops' interviews at regular intervals. Punishments would be given for anybody without the most steadfast testimonies. Folks in the community would disappear and nobody would dare question where they went, or if those people would ever be seen again. Were they sent to labor camps until their testimony was strong enough? Were they sent to fight foreign wars? Were they outright blood atoned for committing the crime of apostasy? You better not ask, or you're questioning the ways of God, and you could be next. The idea of a Mormon theocracy plagues my nightmares. But what I'm really driving at here is a question that I've wrestled with for years. Was it a good thing for Joseph Smith to die? I want us all to sit with that question for a long time while acknowledging our biases. There isn't an objective conclusion to this question because there are millions of people across the globe who consider the death of Joseph Smith to be the worst event in human history. I, however, have spent years highlighting the absolutely worst aspects of this man, sparing no page of script to bleed his legacy by 1,000 cuts until all that remains is a hollow shell, a scarecrow held together by lies. And I want you all to understand that the question of whether it was a good thing for Joseph Smith to die is something which has plagued my daily walk and sucked my dreams into oblivion for years now. And I think the question breaks down into two components, which are equally perplexing for me. Did he deserve to die, and was it the best outcome for him to die? One of those questions is retrospective, the other is prospective. And I'm not letting myself or any of you out of this. This isn't an easy question. We don't get to say that it's always wrong for somebody to be murdered and, do away with the question because it's rarely an option, especially when we're faced with such a complicated trolley problem that is Joseph Smith. We also don't get to say that Joseph Smith was a monster who murdered people, stole everything that people had. He caused untold pain, anguish, sickness, and death of his followers. He committed treason while a military leader. He made his living from lying to people every moment of every day of his professional life. He raped children. He absolutely deserved to die. And then the question is dealt with because where does that line of thought begin and end? I see people posting that George Floyd deserved to die because he was a criminal. These two people are obviously not equal, but the result of capital punishment for crimes from this line of thinking comes from the same place. That thought process creates systems of law that give the death penalty to atheists and adulterers and commits genocide against people with a different skin color or God. Remember, it was against German law to oppose the Third Reich. So did Joe deserve to die? Legally for the time and legally in most states and countries today, yes. Many countries have outlawed the death penalty. Can a society really consider itself free while state-sanctioned murder is the status quo? Whether that murder be through the court system murdering people who commit heinous crimes with a deranged mind, or that murder be abrogated to an 18-year-old with a machine gun murdering people that our government has labeled terrorists, can society progress while government kills citizens of its own country or other countries? What are reasonable criteria for governments to murder people? Once the criteria are established, can we be certain that the murders our government commits are all 100% justified and reasonable, or is there a margin of error that we tolerate? If 98% of felons are sent to death row on incontrovertible evidence, are those other 2% of innocent people we murder negligible? Something which we can't disentangle from state-sanctioned murder is the mythology which fuels it. When we kill somebody on death row, we're basically saying, you've committed such a horrible crime that any punishment we could foist on you isn't good enough. We have to send you to God, and He'll give you the punishment you deserve. Can we tolerate this mythological undertone in a secular nation? And all of this says nothing about vigilante justice and lynchings, which is really at issue in the case of Joseph Smith. What does it say about our society and government when people take capital punishment into their own hands without government sanction? This says, you are such a pariah of our society. We don't care what the law says. We're going to kill you anyway. This nation has a truly long and abhorrent history of racially motivated lynchings. They still happen today. But is there ever a case where somebody like Joseph Smith demonstrates himself completely untouchable by law, who continues to commit acts deserving the penalty where vigilante justice is warranted? Not only is it warranted, but it's the only solution in his case specifically. Did Joe deserve to die? I'm going to say he didn't deserve to die. Whether by vigilante justice or state-sanctioned murder, I don't think he deserved death. I think anytime we give government license to kill its own citizens, really anybody, we quickly find ourselves in dangerous power dynamics. Let's deal with the second component of this question. Was it the best outcome for him to die? This is a bit more complex. Mormonism had reached critical mass long before Carthage, and Joe's movement obviously doesn't die with him, so we can put that aspect of the question to the side. Had Joe been able to carry out his greatest designs, world history would be very different. He would have caused an indescribable amount of death, suffering, and harm to billions of people for generations to come. If we could somehow harness the energy from the suffering he would have caused if he remained alive and free, we could power the rotation of the galaxy itself for time and eternity. If we could somehow quantify the suffering he would have caused if allowed to live, was it the most moral outcome for him to die on June 27th, 1844? Yes, I think it was, but not for the reasons you might think. Suffering in jail for the rest of his life would cause him an incredible amount of suffering. The law would, catch up with him eventually. This isn't a judgment on Joe. It's a judgment about our justice system that's based on retributive justice, not rehabilitative justice. Joseph would have languished for years and suffered, and that's acceptable to a lot of people. Don't go to jail, don't commit a crime. You won't go to jail and you won't suffer. He would have suffered a lot, but it wouldn't have done anything to make him a better human being. It would have only fueled the fire burning inside him and caused his followers to further cling to that persecution complex. This would only accelerate his grand designs and the fanaticism of his followers, especially if he ever ended up escaping from prison like he had done before. For the suffering he caused, the wrongs he committed, and the suffering he would have experienced with a life in prison, I think it was best for him to die that day, in my opinion. But that's my opinion. What do you think? Should he have been murdered that day? If your answer is yes, would you have pulled the trigger that day? Would you have been a spectator? Would you have been a Levi Williams who put the assassination into motion but didn't actually fire a gun? There isn't an objective conclusion to these questions because they tap into difficult aspects of human morality. Justice, retribution, freedom, the worth of human life. There aren't simple answers. It's never simple because we're dealing with the most precious possession that humanity has, humanity itself. When we see injustices by a person like Joseph Smith, we want simple answers. We yearn for simple answers, then wonder what it is about the concept of eternal paradise and punishment from Daddy who knows everything that we've done is so appealing to billions of people. Why is religion so appealing and effective? Because humanity is ugly, and we're creatures who want simple answers. Besides, the worst thing about Joseph Smith isn't anything he personally did. It's not the murder. It's not the serial rape. It's not the habitual lying for self-serving motives. It's not the treason or the intent of a theocratic revolution. It's not all the brazen crime and raising militias and shadow assassin squads. It's not the white supremacy and visions of racial cleansing for white purity. All of these things done in the name of the voice in his head, his God, Elohim. Those are all reprehensible, but they aren't the worst things he did. The worst thing Joseph Smith did wasn't anything specific, but rather what he started. Truly, the worst thing about this human is his successors. No treatment of Joseph Smith's belief, his sense of morality, or his daily conduct can be complete without examining the system that he created and the people who followed his footsteps. Joseph Smith was a horrible person, but Brigham Young was simply on a different level. Everything Joe dreamed of doing, Brigham actually did. Joe's most malevolent plans for America were carried out by Brigham Young in the nation of Deseret. Joe's racial supremacy doctrines were carried out by Brigham Young, who committed genocide and created the largest isolated eugenics experiment in American history.
You know that Mormon theocratic dystopia of alternate history I was talking about earlier? You may think, oh, that would never happen, but everything that I described happened to some extent in Utah under the tyrannical reign of bloody Brigham fucking Young, which presents a larger point: intellectual contagion. Look, Joseph Smith didn't make Mormonism in the larger sense. The culture he grew up in made him, and he took bits and pieces from that culture, beliefs, ideas, concepts, philosophies of men, if you will, and he simply plagiarized and reskinned them to be his own flavor of those things. Nothing he did was original. His path through life is perfectly consistent with countless demagogues before and after him. The culture made the man who made the religion that was weaponized by somebody much smarter than him. For any successful religion to grow beyond a few families, you need an ideas guy followed by a business guy. Yes, guy, I mean that. That's an indictment, not an endorsement. Intellectual contagion, the force of populism, outlives the person who spawns their specific flavor of it. We see these same patterns around us every day. We can't stop them, but we can't afford to not fight them. Ideas are more resilient than the fragile human skulls which carry them. It doesn't matter what populist movement you examine, it doesn't arise from a vacuum. Joe wasn't the most successful imposter the world has ever seen. He was yet another among a swampland of monsters. He was ignorant of almost everything around him. He was coarse and brazen and corrupt and beholden to all manner of vice. His lust for power, wealth, and control dragged him to his grave kicking and screaming. Everything for him was instant gratification and convenience. He never considered the consequences of his actions if they happened more than 5 minutes from the present. He could never choose the good in the future when there was an evil close at hand. He was no better or worse than a common trickster. He just had more people who paid attention to him. He wasn't a sage old man with a strong drink at the end of the bar. He was a child in a man's body who drank like a miner and was arrogant to his own destruction. He hated authority and fought at every step of his path to supplant any systems of power with his own words of "Thus saith the Lord." He was a chameleon who bounced from piety to levity, purity to lust, magnanimity to wrath, depending on who was there to perceive his conduct. He was physically strong, mentally cunning, and morally perverse, a dangerous combination. But truly what makes him the most corrupt is what those who followed him accomplished. The people who followed Joseph Smith were leaders and the led. Any system of belief will present an irresistible pile of excrement to amoral flies wandering the wilderness. The ranks of Mormon leadership were filled with unprincipled, defiled, and morally bankrupt monsters, the exact people with which Joe got along so very well. These vicious leaders co-opt the credulity of the wandering followers who know very little of human nature and who give every possession, minute, and desire to their leaders. These are the victims of the monstrous, self-feeding system of the ignominious leading the honest and simple. Religion remains the most powerful human tool for the strong to control the weak, a cloak of safety given to the sheep by the wolves with comforting words and promises of eternal riches. Hollow assurances to satisfy the hungry with the smell of food, to cure the dying with spit and mud, to uplift the depressed with derision for daring to not be filled with joy. A person sacrifices their autonomy and sentience to this force, and they become a sacrificial pawn to the game lord, gluttonous for power, wealth, and control. Don't read that. It makes God angry. Don't like that person. It makes God angry. Don't listen to them. They make God angry. But the real power lies on the flip side of that coin. Do this, steal that, kill them. You wouldn't want to make God angry, would you? The greatest aspiration of Mormonism is no secret. It will not die until it rules the world. From Joseph Smith to the current nonagenarian running the company with a skull full of slushy mix, each prophet has worked tirelessly to make this cult the most powerful cult in the world. Hundreds of billions of dollars, millions of followers, millions of acres of land, politicians calling and asking what they can do for the church, meeting with presidents and foreign dignitaries under the guise of spreading the gospel, a sales force tens of thousands strong, giving their own hard-earned money to have the privilege of selling the church for 2 years. At its heart, this is what kingdom building looks like in our modern world. Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Zion, the New Jerusalem, will be built on the American continent. The field is white, all ready to harvest. Consecrate the property of the Gentiles. They will vex the Gentiles with a sore vexation. Oh, Mormons are so nice. They're programmed to be everything that they are. Make no mistake. All it takes is one modern bloody Brigham Young for Mormonism to quickly become the greatest domestic threat in American history. It's too wealthy, it's too powerful, it's too dangerous to ignore. Joseph Smith created a doomsday cult with murderous oaths of fealty and secrecy. The scariest part is, we have yet to see this religion live up to its full potential. And that's a force of nature worth fighting. Thank you, listeners. For the sake of nostalgia, one last time, let's drift away from Safe Harbor together. I'll see you on the battlefield.